Hi folks, this is Jay. Hope you're okay today. We're looking at the origin of the four Gospels by Konstantin von Tischendorf. Now, I don't agree everything with Tischendorf. He's a very famous scholar of the 19th century which I'll tell you a little bit about him, about his life. He was born in January 18, 1915, died December 7th, 1874. He was a noted German biblical scholar. This is from Wikipedia, but I'm just reading a little bit of this, just so you get the facts. He deciphered the Codex Ephremi Rescriptus, a 5th century Greek manuscript of the New Testament in 1840, rediscovered the Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century New Testament manuscript. So that's just a little bit about him, and if you go on Wikipedia you'll find massive information that's very helpful. You get a list of his books, and there's links to his various writings, some articles about him. Now the thing about Tischendorf is I don't fully agree with the guy. I don't agree with the new breed of textual critics that came from Tischendorf on textual criticism. I'm more in the Dean Bergen school. However, the work that we're going to look at, recent scholarship over the last 20 years in the Gospels, is showing that the scholars like Rudolf Bultmann and people like that, great weaknesses in that kind of scholarship, and there's been a renewal and a rediscovery of that there's eyewitness material in the Gospels, that the Gospels were written a lot earlier than supposedly people thought, and so there's been a massive a renaissance in turning the clock back from what skeptics were thinking to more of an orthodox position. I'm not saying that everybody agrees. It's noted by some scholars that there'd be a backlash to this kind of conservative way of looking at things, so there will be and is a backlash to it. But the reason why I'm reading from Tischendorf is a lot of the arguments being thrown about today can be answered even by all the new research that's been found with manuscripts and all the various literature that's been found. We can go back to Tischendorf and find arguments that are very helpful for today in the academic world, because it's basically going back to things that we already knew and looking at them in a fresh way. So, for example, going back to Irenaeus and various ancient texts like that, and reinterpreting them. So anyway, let's get to Tischendorf, and his book uses the classical arguments in the defense of the origin of the Gospels, which I think need to be heard today. He says on page 23, the life of Jesus has become center of religious controversies which agitate our age. The importance of this fact is great. At its foundation lies the confession that Christianity is not grounded so much on the doctrine of him from whom it received its name as upon his person. Every acceptation of the word Christianity which is antagonistic to this confession disowns the real character of the term and rests on misconception. The person of Jesus is the cornerstone of which the church bases its foundation. To it the doctrine of Jesus and of his disciples always and with the utmost distinctness points with the person of Jesus. Christianity stands or falls. To rob this person of his greatness, of that greatness which the entire church ascribed to him under the name Son of God, and yet to think to retain the Christian faith and the Christian church is a futile attempt at vain mockery. Even the morality which some might hope to rescue from the general shipwreck of faith is weakened by the unavoidable and remorseless contradictions which arise. For if the morality is sound, it must be a good tree growing from a diseased root. The life of Jesus is the most momentous of all questions which the Church has to encounter, the one which is decisive whether it shall or shall not live. Whence do we derive our knowledge of the life of Jesus? Almost exclusively from our four Gospels, in which the divine person of Jesus, the centre of Christian belief, and the main object of all attacks upon it, is presented in essentially the same light as in the Epistle of Paul. Unquestionably, the oldest of all the apostolic documents, all else that we know of him is confirmed to a few expressions and acts, and the unimportant exceptions is in the direct connection with and dependent on the Gospels. By far the most of these sources are to be found in the apocryphal, i.e. not genuine, untrustworthy fragments, not bearing the true names of their authors and aiming the more or less skill to supplement and complement the Gospel narratives. Others, partly of Jewish and partly of heathen origin, avow that very outset the intention of assailing the Gospels. Finally, we possess the two classical writers of the first and the two following centuries, Tacitus and Pliny. A few incidental expressions which have a lasting interest, the first testifying that Christ, the founder of the religion which had gained so strong a hold even in Nero's time, had been punished with death by the procurator Pontius Pilate, and during the reign of Tiberius, while Pliny asserts in a communication to Trajan that the Christians already, a numerous body in Bithynia, were in the habit of singing songs of praise to Christ as to a god. Our Gospels, therefore, if not the only authorities relative to the life of Jesus, are by all odds the most important ones, and the only direct sources that are in existence. If then the life of Jesus is only made to us by the Gospels, if we are directed to these books for the solution of all our questions about the birth, the activities, the conversation, character, and fortunes of Jesus, we have, of course, no less weighty an inquiry before us than this: whence spring our Gospels? For upon the origin of these books hinge their trustworthiness and all their value. So much depending on this first step, very many are the investigations which have been made in these modern times into the origin of the Gospels. It has been a question with what justice the names of the prominent members of the 12, Matthew and John, and the names of the helpers and followers, Mark and Luke, have been assigned to the four Gospels. Just so far as the authorships of these documents has been admitted as due to those revered men, the Gospels have been accepted as authentic and trustworthy record of the life of the Lord. Their names have been regarded as satisfactory guarantee that in the writing which they were coupled, truth could only be sought, that in them truth only was wished, and that in them truth was authentically recorded. There is indeed another way of testing the reliability of the Gospels. After the rise of rationalizing or rationalistic spirit, and then when the attempt was made to set the reason of man above everything which had previously borne the name of divine revelation, hands were laid at once on the biblical miracles, and it was claimed that they must be explained by the light of the imperfect culture of that time and the incorrect appreciation of the Old Testament. Out of this grew the theory of accommodation, as it was called, which asserted that Jesus made his words chime in with the expectation of his age, and that he gave himself out to be a more important personage than he really was. This theory of the rise of the Gospels has culminated in the piece of botchwork which issued from the Paris press in 1863. The author of that book, not troubling with any speculations respecting the share with which the apostles may have had in delineated the gospel portraits, but following his own self-imposed theories about miracles and revelations, has displayed boundless recklessness and given way to the most unbridled fantasies respecting the gospel history, caricaturing both it and its hero. He has written a book which has much more the character of a shameless calumny of Jesus than of an honest investigation into his career. Can we apply the terms historical inquiry to an attempt to show that John wrote the fourth gospel out of a spirit of self-love, not without jealousy of Peter and full of hatred to Judas Iscariot? Can we dignify by so high a term as scientific investigation such a theory as is respected the cause of sympathy felt for Jesus by the wife of Pilate, that she saw the Gentile Galilean, the fine-looking young man, from a window of the palace that looked out in the temple court, and that in consequence the thought that blood was to be spilled rested like a mountain load upon her soul? To cite one or two more examples of this mode of dealing with the Gospels, What shall we say of his manner of treating raising of Lazarus, where he endeavours to show that Jesus, whose role was becoming more and more difficult every day, practiced an involuntary piece of deception? End of quote. End a bit there. What I want to say here, what Tischendorf is doing is he's just taking on various scholars of his time. But what is very interesting, which modern scholars today often don't tell you, is the evangelical scholars of the 19th century were dealing with these textual critical issues in a very scientific way, trying to do it in an objective way. And what is not often remembered or noted is the more esoteric, creative scholarship, the Strausses, the Reynolds, were people who did not base their scholarship on as a scientific foundation, as people like Tischendorf. And so Tischendorf is absolutely demolishing his opponents by sticking to good methodology, trying to keep us objective to the evidence of the facts, rather than presenting theories that are creative but not based in any reality of fact. And that's what you see from the 19th century onwards to the 20th century. Modern textual critics and modern New Testament scholars come into the subject with creative theories that have very little evidence and the ignoring of a vast weight of evidence. And no matter how objective you come, it was impossible to break this noose that these kind of scholars have got. However, things are changing today in the academic world. But the point is this, that people like Tischendorf and Bishop Lightfoot and many others had to fight tooth and nail to try and be sober scholars and critique the more popular scholarship that was trying to win over the people's thinking, but was not actually based in any decent scholarship whatsoever. And we have to blame the German scholars for that, for being too esoteric. And so we're going to jump a few pages now, because he goes into Renan and he goes into a few other scholars, and we'll get into some of the meat. It seems to me, he says, that this duty has been by no means faithfully enough met for the first three so-called synoptic gospels, and still less for that of John, whose want of authenticity has been inscribed in flaming letters upon the banners of the negative school. The writer of these lines imposes upon himself the task of trying to throw some light upon the evangelical documents, although in preparing the work not as special students but cultivated Christians generally, it may not be possible to enter so exhaustively into the subject as under the circumstances might be desirable. We can make as our starting point the unquestioned fact that in the last decade of the 2nd century our four Gospels were known and acknowledged in all portions of the Church. Here we get into some meat now. Irenaeus from 177 on, Bishop of Lyons, where the first Christian Church of Gaul was established, wrote a great work in the last decades of the 2nd century, directed the early heresies, the Gnostic, and on every page made use of the Gospels. Now this fact, this is me now, not Tischendorf, this fact alone is absolutely devastating to people like Bart Ehrman and modern textual critics and modern conspiracy theories about the New Testament. End of quote. That was just, let's get back to Tischendorf. Irenaeus on every page made use of the Gospel, providing himself from them with material to overthrow a system which was threatening to destroy the doctrines of the Church. The number of passages where he has recourse to the Gospels is about 400, and about 80 of these contain quotations from the Gospel of John. I mean, to me, this is me again, to me this is absolutely devastating to any critic of the New Testament. Because what it tells you is the four Gospels were early historical material. When you compare this historical material to, say, the life of Caesar or to the life of Cleopatra or whatever, this is astounding, because it's telling you that these sources go back early on. Now, one perceptive atheist said, what do you mean by early? Well, early can mean within 50 years of the event. It can mean 100 years of the event. whether it be 50 years or 100, it's still compared in the ancient history and ancient literature. It's vastly superior to any ancient literature when it comes to historical information. It says, from the closing decades of the 2nd century on, the able and learned Tertullian lived and labored at Carthage in Africa, and in his numerous writings there exist hundreds of citations from the text of the Gospels. Again, this is me, devastating to Bart Ehrman and modern scholars today who would attack the veracity of the New Testament, which, back to Tischendorf, which he made use of as his most decisive authorities. The same is true of Clemens and the celebrated teacher in the school of the Catacombs at Alexandria about the end of the 2nd century. Nor must I fail to allude to a catalogue generally known by the name of its discoverer, the ancient scholar Muratori, of all the books which were regarded as canonical in the very earliest times. This work was probably prepared at Rome and shortly after the time of the Roman Bishop Pius II. Some were between 160 to 170 AD. In this catalogue of books, thus reckoned as comprising the New Testament, the 4 Gospels are at the head. It is true the first few lines, which relate to Matthew and Mark, have been lost, but at the close of the still extant words respecting the later, the Gospel of Luke is spoken of as the 3rd and that of John as the 4th, enabling us to see that even in the very earliest days the order was followed with which we are so familiar. I have thus summoned the witness from Gaul, from Proconsular Africa, the present Algiers, from Alexandria, and from Rome. 2 others can be cited fitly here, although one of them goes back to the remoter date. End of Tischendorf. I'll carry on in a minute. Here's an important point that the textual critics, Bart Ehrman, and many scholars fail to see, and the critics. Notice that Tischendorf is showing that we have a bishop from Gaul, a leader from Africa, a leader from Alexandria, and from Rome. Different parts of the ancient world believing in the Gospels as written by the writers who wrote them. That is a highly significant fact. What that tells you, if that's happening in the 2nd century, what that clearly tells you, and skeptics do not fathom this out, and you need to understand that if the gospel has spread in the 2nd century so wide and was so well known in the 2nd century, it clearly shows you that these are going back to the 1st century. And not only going back to the 1st century, but they are intricately connected to the historical. Here's a quote. Here's a very important point. The historical oral tradition of the Gospels. Now, notice I didn't say oral tradition, I said historical tradition. Very important distinction there. James Dunn has made that distinction, and it's a very important distinction. Because in the ancient church, in the gospel, writers of the gospels, there were 2 types of oral tradition. Just a parenthesis, oral tradition, you have to look at it in it's culturally specific. That's another issue that a lot of skeptics fail to realize. Each culture has a different aspect, a different way of passing on its oral traditions, and so they are culturally specific. And within the time of the gospels, there were 2 types of oral tradition, the one where you passed it on by mouth, and what we would call historical oral tradition. That is, individual people who were seen as important in collecting the historical information of the past and passing it on, either by writing or by verbal passing it on. So what the whole point is that what Tischendorf has noted here, which is very important, is that the Gospels were already well known in the 2nd century in Gaul, Africa, Alexandria, and Rome, which tells you they are 1st century documents, which tells you that they have been carefully preserved with coming from historical oral tradition. Okay, let's get back to Tischendorf. If you want more information on that, go and listen to James Dunn's lectures on oral tradition. So Tischendorf says 2 others can be cited fitly here, although one of them goes back to remoter date. I mean the 2 oldest translations of the Greek text used by the apostles themselves. One of these is the Syriac version and bears the name of Piscido, and the other is the Latin version known under the title Itala. Both of them give the 4 Gospels their place. The canonical acceptance of all 4 must unquestionably be general, as we see that they were transferred openly and as a whole in the language of the newly converted Christians, the Latinists and Syrians. The Syriac translation, which takes us to the neighbourhood of the Euphrates, is almost universally assigned to the end of the 2nd century, and although positive proofs are wanting in support of this date, yet we are not without good grounds for accepting it. The Latin version, on the contrary, had begun to gain general recognition even before the end of the 2nd century, for both Tertullian in his quotations from Irenaeus and the Latin translator of Irenaeus' great work against heresy, writing about the end of the 2nd century, make use of the text of the Itala. This, of course, implies that Latin translation was made some years before the close of the 2nd century. I shall have occasion subsequently to allude again to the striking fact that it was necessary to translate the Gospels into Latin and Syriac as early as the second half of the 2nd century, and that the number of documents was limited to the 4 with which we are now familiar. Looking a little more closely into the testimony of the 2 great fathers, Irenaeus and Tertullian, we have to ask, can their evidence be so limited in its application as only to prove that the 4 Gospels were fully accepted in their day? Irenaeus not merely invests these documents with entire authority in the citations which he makes to overthrow the Gnostic heretics. It even appears in his work that the Gospels, or rather to use his own expression, the fourfoldness of the Gospel has been conformed to the analogy of the 4 quarters of the globe, the 4 chief winds, the 4 faces of the cherubim. He asserts that the 4 Gospels are the 4 pillars on which the Church rests, as it covers the whole earth, and in the number of 4 recognized a special token of the Creator's wisdom. Is such a representation compatible with the facts that at the time of Irenaeus the 4 Gospels first began to be accepted, or that an attempt was then being made to append a 4th and newer one to the 3 older ones then current? Is it not much more credible that the acceptance of all the 4 was then of so long standing and so thoroughly complete that the Bishop of Lyons could allude to the fourfoldness of the Gospel as a thing universally recognized, and in consequence of this very recognition speak of it as a thing which harmonizes with great and unchanging cosmical relations? Irenaeus died in the 2nd year after the close of the 2nd century, but in his youth he had sat at the feet of the venerable Polycarp, who had been a disciple of John the Evangelist, and had been acquainted with many eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. In mentioning this fact, Irenaeus alludes very tenderly to the statement of his teacher Polycarp, that all that he had heard from the lips of John and other disciples of Jesus coincided fully with the written account. Yet let us hear his own words, and given in a letter to Florinus: I saw you while I was yet a youth in Lower Asia with Polycarp, when you were living in the scenes of princely splendour, and when you were striving to gain the approval of Polycarp. What took place then is fresher in my memory than what has occurred more recently. What we took in our youth grows up, as it were, with us, and is incorporated in us, and as such even now bring back to mind just the place where the good Polycarp used to sit, when he talked to us, how he looked as he came in and as he went out, and how as he lived, how he used to speak to the people, how he used to allude to his intercourse with John and repeat the words of the others who had seen the Lord, or how he used to recount what he had heard from their own lips about the miracles and the teachings of the Lord, and all in full accordance with the written narrative. Thus writes Irenaeus respecting his intercourse with Polycarp, and respecting the communication of Polycarp. The date of the young Irenaeus' intercourse with the agreed saint must be set approximately at about the year 150 AD. Irenaeus died in 202 AD, according to old accounts, a martyr, while Polycarp perished at the stake in 165 AD, after having, quote, to use his own expression, quote, served the Lord 86 years, end of quote. Is it to be believed that Irenaeus never heard from his teacher, whose communications respecting John he expressively refers to? One word regarding the Gospel of John? Indisputably, one part of Polycarp's testimony relative to John's Gospel carries us back to John himself. Just having a little rest here for a second. But Polycarp's evidence respecting the work of his teacher must be based upon the testimony of his teacher. The case becomes all the more clear the more closely we look into it on the adversary side and range ourselves with those who deny the validity of John's gospel. According to this view, Polycarp, although saying so much to Irenaeus regarding John, did not drop a word regarding the gospel of John. But supposing he did not, is it credible that Irenaeus fully accepted that gospel, that work which seemed to be the noblest gift of John to Christianity, the report of an eyewitness respecting the life, death, and resurrection of the Saviour of the world, as a gospel which ran directly counter the testimony of the three other evangelists? Would not the very circumstances that Polycarp made no mention of it have convinced Irenaeus of its want of authenticity? And yet it is asserted that in order to meet and overthrow false teachers and the men who falsified the canon, he did not hesitate to reckon the Gospel of John strictly embracing among the sacred books. This on which I am now laying stress is nothing new. It has long stood recorded on those pages of Irenaeus. It has long been read there, but it has not had its due weight. Else how could it have been so lightly passed over? For my own part, I must completely justify the assigning of much greater weight on the part of correct and thorough investigators to the testimony of Polycarp and Irenaeus respecting the Gospel of John, than to all the difficulties and all the objections urged by skeptical scholars. And is the case not similar with Tertullian and his testimony respecting the Gospel? This man, who had been transformed from a worldly heathen lawyer into a powerful advocate of divine truth, enters so critically into the question of the origin and relative value of the four Gospels as expressly to subordinate Mark, Luke to Matthew and John on the ground that the former were mere helpers and companions of the apostles, while the later were selected by the Lord himself and invested with full authority. The same author propounds also an inexpugnable canon of historical criticism, a test of truth of the early Christian documents, and especially those of apostolic origin, in that he makes the value of testimony dependent on the epoch of the witness, and demands that what was held as true in his day should be judged in the light of its prior acceptance. If it has been accepted before, it was fair to suppose that it had been equally accepted in the time of the apostles. Its authenticity must therefore have been admitted by the apostolical church, founded as it was by the apostles themselves. And is it to be believed that this acute man was capable of being deceived in his acceptance of the Gospels and in his defense of them by anything web of sophistry or touch of charlatanism? The passages just referred to are taken from his celebrated reply to Marcion, who in wanton and heretical spirit had impuged the authenticity of the Gospels. 3 of the 4 he had only excluded, and of the 4 he retained only just so much as it pleased him to do. In reply to him, Tertullian expressly based his argument on the ground that at the time when the Apostolic Church was founded, all the 4 Gospels were accredited. Has such a statement no weight in the mouth of a man like Tertullian, when he wrote scarcely 100 years had elapsed since the death of John? At that date, the testimony appealed to by him of the church at Ephesus, in which John had laboured so long and amid which had died, must have been full and decisive respecting the genuineness or spurious of John's Gospel. Nor was it a matter of any difficulty to ascertain what was the judgment with this church passed on the Gospel. And we must not overlook the fact that we have not to do in this matter with a scholar who is contenting himself with merely learned investigations, but with a man full of earnestness respecting his faith and taking very seriously the question of human salvation. The Christian documents which asserted a connection between themselves and the origin of the new faith, the documents which all the worldly wisdom of the time in which Tertullian himself was reared took offence, were they likely to be accepted by him without inquiry and in a blind credulity? And inasmuch as he expressly assures us that he bases his acceptation of all the 4 Gospels on the credit of the Apostolic Church, is it not unworthy suspicion the doubting that he made through inquiry into the capacity of the Apostolic Church to pass on an authentic judgment on the Christian documents? End of quote. I'll just reflect on what he said here and tell you my thoughts about this. Basically, what he's saying, you've got all these esoteric modern scholars of his day saying that we've got to get under the Gospels, and what the church is telling us is not true. The Gospels are of later antiquity, a later date. They're not actually decent historical source material. They don't go to the 1st century. They're probably all 2nd century documents. These are the kind of ideas that were being spouted at the time of Tischendorf. What Tischendorf does is just go to the historical documents. He goes to the historical information, things that scholars already knew but just overlooked and didn't give them the weight that they deserved. So he goes to Irenaeus, ancient apostolic father, and he notices in Irenaeus' writing that he's quoting the 4 Gospels, and that he says the 4 Gospels are like the 4 corners of the earth. And what he's saying is, look, this is just really good historical information that we're getting here, and we're just pushing it aside. And if we listen to this historical information, it's telling us the Gospels were not 1st century but 2nd century, not only 2nd century, but written by the people that we believe they were written by. And then he goes on to Tertullian, who is combating Marcion, who denied some of the Gospels because they were Jewish, and anything Jewish, Marcion did not want in his canon. So Tertullian is combating this, and Tertullian is quite clearly making it clear that there are 4 Gospels. So again, what Tischendorf is saying is this is just brilliant historical information to confirm that the 4 Gospels were written in the 1st century and were written by the people they were written by. And I think he's correct. And I think there has been a witch hunt by modern scholarship over the last 150 years against Irenaeus and Tertullian, not really wanting to give full weight to this kind of, to these people. That's me. Back to Tischendorf. He says, I insist, therefore, to sum up the matter, that the testimony of Irenaeus and Tertullian respecting the 4 Gospels is not to be taken as an isolated, unrelated fact, but it must be considered as a valid result of all the historical evidence which was at their command. And how far we are justified in this is shown not only by the authorities already adduced, the author of the Martori list of New Testament books, the African translators of the Gospels into Latin, and the originator of the Itala, but by all the other witnesses who lived prior to the time of Irenaeus and Tertullian. Many of my readers are acquainted with the so-called harmonies of the Gospels, the works in which the 4 sacred narratives are coordinated into single one. In this way, an effort has been made to draw the Gospels alone to as closely followed and faithful portrait of our Lord's life, those points which one narrator has brought more prominently into view than the others being employed as supplementary the other accounts, and a complete picture being the result. In these works, the narrative of John has been drawn upon to supply the incidents occurring in the last 3 years of Jesus' life, and to follow his course step by step. Harmonies of this kind were prepared as early as 170 AD by 2 men whose names are known to us. One of them was Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch in Syria, and the other was Tatian, a disciple of Justin, the great theologian and martyr. True, both of those works are lost, but Jerome speaks in the 4th century of the one prepared by Theophilus as still existing, describing it as a combination of the 4 Gospels in one continuous narrative. Respecting the second, we have the testimony of Eusebius and Theodoret. The later of him speaks within an intimate knowledge. Tatian himself alludes to his work as the Gospel made up of 4, the Diatessaron. Both of these men wrote other works which are still extant. In 180 and 181, Theophilus indicted the 3 books as to Orchilochus, a learned heathen who had assailed Christianity. And in this work are extracts from Matthew, Luke, and John. It is especially noteworthy that he cites the later chapter 2:22, alluding explicitly to the name of the author. His words are, "This is taught by the Holy Scriptures, and all inspired men, among whom is John, who says, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him." This makes it certain that the harmony of the Theophilus embraced the Gospel of John. The same is true of Tatian, for in his address To the heathen, a work filled with learning and very decided in its tone, written probably between 160 and 170 AD, there are several passages quoted from John's Gospel, such as this: "The light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The light was the light of men, and all things were made by him." From this it would seem certain that his harmony, like that of Theophilus, although it may have taken some liberties with the order of the narrative, included the Gospel of John, and this chimes admirably with the statement of Bishop Bar Salabi that the Diatessaron of Tatian, accompanied by a commentary by Ephraim and thus discriminated from the Diatessaron of Ammonius, began with the words, "In the beginning was the Word." These harmonies last mentioned, one of which must with much probability be ascribed to a date within the first 60 years of the 2nd century, are far more worth than that would be gathered from a single scattered extracts for their preparation points back conclusively to time when the 4 Gospels were already accepted as a perfect record, and when the necessity had begun to be felt of deducing a higher unity and a more harmonious completeness from them than the diversity of various books, and the apparent discrepancies had rendered apparent. If these efforts are to be assigned to a date as early as the 2nd decade, subsequently to the middle of the 2nd century, it makes the inference a necessary one that the use of the recognition of the 4 Gospels must be assigned to a much earlier date. Totally agree. So basically he's saying there that there were these gospel harmonies right from around about 160 AD. That's basically what he's saying. And these various gospel harmonies that were based on 4 Gospels, which shows again that they were already authoritative, and that pushes the date of the Gospels back into the 1st century and to the authorship of those Gospels. So that's basically what he's arguing for there. He goes on, similar testimony we owe to the contemporary of the 2 men just named, Claudius Apollinaris, Bishop of Hierapolis and Phrygia, whose epoch is assigned by Eusebius, 426, to the reign of Marcus Aurelius. For in a fragment preserved in the Chronicon Paschal, he declares that if the Quadrisimenians, so called from holding like the Jews that the 14th of Nisan was the day for celebrating the Paschal sacrifice, appealed justly to Matthew in support of the view that Jesus partook of the Last Supper with his disciples at the precise time of celebrating the Paschal offering. There must be an antagonism among the writers of the several Gospels. Now, as in this context, Matthew, Mark, and Luke must be ranged on the side, and John on the other. The words of Apollinaris indicate that all the Gospels were conceded in his day to have equal value. To this may be added that in one passage still extant in the same Chronicon there is undeniable reference to John's allusion in chapter 19:34 to the piercing of Jesus' side. According to Eusebius, the choice of Dionysius as Bishop of Corinth occurred in the year 170 AD. The same historian has preserved for us, Eusebius 423, some fragments of letters and other documents from the pen of Dionysius. To one church he sent in the epistolary form exposition of Scripture, and to the Romans he wrote after animadverting severely upon the efforts to discredit the genuineness of his own letters. That it was not all strange that men sought to discredit the gospel, since these 2 were documents whose value was so great that their authenticity should be indisputable. The expression Holy Scriptures might not necessarily refer to the New Testament, but the word which Dionysius employs writing respecting the law, the same term which Clement of Alexandria uses, Strom, page 7, verse 1, has the same signification with the expression New Testament, and relates evidently to the books which were then accepted as constituting the New Testament canon. The Apology, written by Athenagoras of Athens in the year 177 AD, contains several quotations from Matthew and Luke. It displays also unmistakably marks of being influenced by John's Gospel, as for example in the passage which speaks of the Logos as the Word of God, and which alludes to the Son of God who is in the Father, as the Father is in the Son. It contains the very expression found in the first chapter of John, 3rd verse, all things were made by him, and in the 7th chapter, 20th verse, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee. I'll just make a point here. What I'm beginning to see here is as a massive scholar who is actually just absolutely got the scholarly period of the 2nd century at his fingertips. I mean, we're going to bishops and writers in Athens about the gospel, so we're in the hands here of a brilliant scholar, and it's marvelous to see. And we do well to listen to what he's saying and realize that a lot of these things that he's saying are actually being confirmed even more as we've gathered more material. And what we need to do is start a renaissance in the academic world to going back to these ancient sources and reassess them with a more objective way of thinking rather than the biased Enlightenment methodologies that came in and have stopped us from actually looking at this source material in a more objective way. We've been too engrossed in source criticism, too engrossed in form criticism, not to rely upon this kind of evidence, which is fatal if we're going to do proper historical reconstruction of how the New Testament came to be. So he says, I have taken these witnesses to the credibility of the four Gospels from the epoch prior to Irenaeus and Tertullian, and just at the threshold of Irenaeus' period, the 2nd and 3rd decades after the middle of the 2nd century. There are, however, left to us other witnesses much earlier, and like those just quoted, men who speak to us right from the very bosom of the Church. Between the apostolic epoch and that which followed there intervened the so-called apostolic fathers. For as direct disciples of the apostles, they must be reckoned as in immediate connection with the apostolic age. If in the little which these men have left us we do not find anything which can be constructed as definite testimony as to the authenticity of the Gospels, still we are not to conclude from their silence that the Gospels were not in existence before their time. But should there be in their writings a constant use of the Old Testament and not the slightest use of the New, in spite of the fact that the later say much nearer to hand, the probability must be accepted as great that at that time the Gospels were not accepted as of equal weight with the Old Testament. And this appears to have been the case with the Epistle of Romans Clement, written in the 2nd or 3rd decade before the close of the 1st century, about a decade after the destruction of Jerusalem. At that time no canon of Gospel was in existence. It is indeed unquestionable that in his epistle, rich in quotation of the Old Testament, Clement refers here and there to passages in the Pauline epistles which have indeed chronologically prior over the Gospels, though not in any other sense. It is otherwise with those other constituents of this literature to whose discussion we now come, the epistles of Ignatius and that of Polycarp. The first of these have reached us in extent variously edited. 3 extant only in Latin are manifestly later additions to the older literature, and so too are 5 others written in Greek, Latin, and Armenian, their authenticity being disowned by the fact that Eusebius makes no allusion to them. There are besides 7 epistles which are extant in longer and shorter form. Of the longer ones, there is also an ancient Latin version of the shorter, a Latin version in the Syriac, an Armenian one as well. With this to be joined the fact that 20 years ago, Syriac version of the 3 of these 7 epistles was discovered, more brief than the short Greek text. After the debate respecting the longer and shorter epistles had been decidedly settled in favour of the shorter, the question arose whether the 3 extant in the Syriac translations are not to be preferred to these even shorter ones. When several scholars declared themselves in favour of this, others defended the earlier origin of the 7 Greek epistles, insisting that the 3 in Syriac were a mere extract intended for devotional use. We hold this to be a more correct view. Similar occurrences are not unknown in the apocryphal writings of the New Testament. An extraordinary proof in this case is afforded by the circumstances that these 7 epistles are not only recognized by Eusebius in 336, but are alluded to in the letter of Polycarp. In order to escape the force of this testimony, the most decisive passage in the later epistle, defended as it is by Eusebius himself, must be set aside as unauthentic. Besides this, the assigning of the superior value of the 3 Syriac letters is invalidated by the fragmentary character of many passages. One is so manifestly an extract from the Greek text that it must be admitted that one section has been lost through carelessness of the copyist. Just a little note here. A Bishop Lightfoot, a 19th century scholar, did a lot of work on these letters. So if you want to, and even now, they're classic pieces of writing. So if you want to know more about Polycarp and these earlier letters of Clement and all the rest, writings, you know, go and read Bishop Lightfoot on Apostolic Fathers, and you'll get some helpful material there. We claim the right, says Tischendorf, therefore, of holding to the authenticity of the 7 epistles ascribed by Eusebius Polycarp to Ignatius, and written while he was on his way from Antioch through Smyrna and Troas to his martyrdom at Rome. Examining them with reference to our present theme, we find several allusions to Matthew and John. Take this passage, letter to the Romans, chapter 6, for what is man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Taken literally from Matthew 16. In like manner, the passage in his epistle to the people of Smyrna, in which he asserts of Jesus that he was baptized by John in order that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him, reminds one of Matthew 3:15. For thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness. In the letter to the Romans, chapter 7, he writes, I want the bread of God, the bread of heaven, and the bread of life, which is the body of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And I want the draught of God, the blood of Jesus, which is imperishable love and eternal life. Compare this with the chapter of John. I am the bread which came down from heaven. I am the bread of life, verse 51, and the bread that I will give in my flesh, verse 54. Whosoever eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood have eternal life. To the Philadelphians he writes in chapter 7, what if some wish to lead me astray after the flesh, but the spirit is not enticed, he is from God. He knows wherever he cometh and whither he goeth, and he bringeth to punishment that which is hidden. These verses have as their basis John 3:6-8. While the last clause grows out of the 20th verse, were these allusions of Ignatius to Matthew and John a mere isolated phenomenon, and one which would be adverse to other points in this discussion, on which no doubts rest, they would not have decisive weight. But so far from militating against other points of evidence, they are in full agreement with them, particularly in the view of the fact that at the time when the letters were written between 107, the date generally assigned, and 115, they contain references to the 2 of the most important of the 4 Gospels. Very important evidence there. Just going to have a drink. See what time we're on here. Just be with you in 1 second. I'm just having a break for a minute. Just feel free to just have a break just for a minute. I really enjoy this kind of stuff. I really love it, and I just like reading this kind of material, and I understand this stuff more than I do cosmology. So we got yeah. So I understand this more. I understand it more than cosmology. That's what I think anyway. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to find out so we're 51 minutes in to this program, and I'm going to just continue for a little bit while longer because it's a very important topic, and you've been given a lot of scholarship to reflect on there and to think about. So let's continue. Tischendorf says the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians connects itself most closely with those of Ignatius. According to his own testimony, it was written very soon after the martyrdom of Ignatius, that is between 107 and 115. It contains very brief quotations from Matthew, as for example in chapter 2, think on the Lord, how he said, judge not that you be not judged. Matthew 7:1, forgive and it shall be forgiven you, similar to Matthew 6:14. Be merciful that you may obtain mercy, compare Matthew 5-7. And with what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you. Again, a literal quotation from Matthew 7:2. And blessed are the poor, that they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Taken almost verbatim from Matthew 5:3 and 10, further, etc. So he goes on, Tischendorf, to show more quotes from these early church fathers. He goes, special weight must be ascribed to the passage in which Polycarp's letter, which clearly manifests the use of the first epistle of John. Polycarp writes, for everyone who does not confess that Jesus is Christ is come in the flesh is an antichrist. In John 4:3, the passage runs, every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus is come in the flesh is not of God, and this is the spirit of Antichrist. The importance of this use by Polycarp of the Epistle of John is based upon this, that although the heroes of doubt bring into suspicion even that which is really indisputable, the Epistle and the Gospel of John are shown by their essential unity of incident and language to have necessarily had the same author. Thus the use of the Epistle argues the use of the Gospel as well. I have shown above from Polycarp's intimate relationship to John how valuable in his testimony it has such great weight as scarcely to allow a word to be uttered in disavowal of the writings which he confirms. The unworthy skill of modern scholars has not shrunk, however, from setting aside the fact of Polycarp's testimony and unnerving its strength. A writer of much acuteness says, we are not compelled to regard the words of Polycarp as an actual quotation from John, for that may have been a sentence which had come into circulation, in which the church may have been committed to paper by John just as well as by Polycarp, without compelling the later to learn it from the former. Before this conjecture had been brutened, which I don't know what that means, a fellow believer had fallen upon another way out of the difficulty. Can the thing not be reversed? May not the author of the Johannine Gospel, which is a little genuine, as so much else that has for 2,000 years received the reverent homage of Christendom, may not this false John have cited as well from Polycarp? It requires a great deal of courage to give utterance to such an idle fancy, yet there are men of learning who are not lacking in this courage. But the universal and radical medicament which must be relied on at the last admits in this instance of double application. If the Gospel of John can be thrown overboard so easily, the Epistle of Polycarp can not so easily be disposed of. Polycarp then did not write the Epistle, yet the disciples of Polycarp Irenaeus believed and gave his witness to just the contrary, but there are never lacking spacious grounds for false position. The professors of the 19th century have the art of putting out of sight even in Irenaeus and his followers. The attack on the authenticity of Polycarp's epistle is all the more worth refuting. If successful, it does away no less with the genuineness of Ignatius' epistles, all the more troublesome if they are to be accepted in the limits which Polycarp and Eusebius assigned to them. On this account, the latest outbreaks of critical presumption and audacity have been directed against the whole Polycarp-Ignatius literature. What one of these critical hearers does not venture, another does. One goes to work more in root and branch and fashion, and another more artistically. The one contents himself with rejecting on his own authority all those passages in Polycarp's letter which allude to the person and epistle of Ignatius, imputing them to a forger known to have lived long before Eusebius' time. The other, on the contrary, casts away the whole letter. In like manner, the one satisfies himself with regarding the 3 shortest Syrian epistles of Ignatius as genuine, the other holds it more advisable to assert that not a single one of the collective letters of Ignatius is genuine. Such things as this would soon convert the temple of God into a common ruin. For my own part, I do not hesitate to advance further in the period of Polycarp. Justin, a martyr even before his violent death in Rome in 160, made his memory clear to the church, had attained to great celebrity through his writings. 3 of his works are still in existence in the complete form, and their authenticity is undisputed. The 2 Apologies and the dialogue with the Jew Tryphon. Eusebius displays perfect familiarity with the 2, which were written to defend Christianity against the attacks of high pagan authorities, and speaks of them as 2 separate works, one of which was dedicated to the Emperor Antonimus, the other to Marcus Aurelius. Jerome repeats the statement of Eusebius, and most scholars down to the present day have coincided with him. The first work must be assigned to the year 138 or 139, the other 161, and the first year of the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Respecting the first, however, it should be said that it was 139 that Marcus Aurelius Vercimus was named as Caesar, yet the inscription does not address him with the imperial title. Very recently there have been new views taken respecting this matter, and there has been unjustified evidence brought forward to support the assigning of the year 147 to the production of the first of the 2 works in question. Some, moreover, have felt themselves justified in taking a position not warranted by Eusebius and Jerome, and in regarding the second Apology as no independent production but a mere appendix to the first. Neither the one view or the other appears to me to be thoroughly grounded. Still, the value of Justin's testimony is very little affected by the question whether he wrote a few years prior or subsequently to the year 148. Yet the fact that these 2 works of Justin's were written prior to the middle of the 2nd century make the question one of the great interest whether he discussed our Gospels in them. It is a topic which has been treated in our time by many persons and with great variance of opinion. What is the essential result again from these investigations? That Justin often quotes from our own Matthew is indisputable. That in various passages follows Mark and Luke is extremely probable. Yet this fact has been invalidated by efforts of some to show that Justin did not use our Gospels as his basis, but writings very like them in character, perhaps the Gospel of the Hebrews, or according to some the Gospel of Peter, which is derived from the letter, but which, with the exception of a few passages, has remained entirely unknown to us to the present time. One support of this view is found in the fact that some quotations of Justin are also found in the Pseudo-Clement homilies, having the same or similar differences from the readings in a canonical text. The supposition, however, perhaps an admissible one, that Justin at the very earliest times drew that the Gospel of Hebrews, which contains such repeated references to Matthew in the circle of his evangelical quotations, in one of his first works, for we have Eusebius' authority in the first half of the 4th century for the fact that at the time this Gospel was reckoned by several authorities as belonging to the canon. On the other hand, it is manifest and groundless exercise of arbitrary authority to hold that such of his quotations as harmonize more or less closely with our received text are taken from a source respecting which we are left to conjecture alone. Such a view is all the more inadmissible from the fact that free extracts from our Gospels are fully in accordance with the character of the times which they fall, and this same epoch, the first half of the 2nd century, to which we trace the main origin of the diverse materials which enter into the canon, and more especially the Gospels. With equal freedom, Justin makes his quotations from the Old Testament, even if he may not be proved to take the text exclusive from the standard Septuagint. And the fact is not to be overlooked that the passage quoted by Justin from the Gospels cannot be judged by the documents comprising the New Testament text, which has come down to us, and which forms the substance of our usual editions. It is clear that many of our most widely diffused readings have proceeded from earlier or more recent corruptions in the principal text. The Gospels especially were subject to arbitrary changes within the very first 10 years after they had been committed to writing. My discussion thus far of the extracts which Justin makes, just a little thought, completely disagree with Tischendorf there. That's just my thought. Just a little thought. I don't agree with him there. And that comes down to his different school of textual criticism than mine, by the way. I think he made a mistake in his development of his textual criticism. I prefer the more Byzantine textual criticism of Dean Bergen. Anyhow, my discussion, he says, thus far of this extract which Justin makes from the Gospels relates solely to those which he draws from the synoptic ones. The first three, despite the prevailing skepticism in this matter, it is good as certain that Justin made use of these three Gospels, but all the more obstinate is the assertion that he had no acquaintance with the John's Gospel. But what in fact is his relation to John? In my opinion, there is more cognate reason for believing that John was read and used by Justin. The delineation of the person of Christ, characteristics of John, as for example in the opening of the Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and in the verse 14 it became flesh, as well as the general designation of Jesus as the Logos, a Word of God, appears unmistakably in not a few passages in Justin, such as for instance as, and Jesus Christ was begotten in the manner wholly peculiar to himself as the Son of God, while he also is the Word Logos of the same. Primeval force, after the Father of all God, and the Lord is the Son and the Word Logos, and I shall show how he through the incarnation became man. The Word Logos of God is the Son of the same. End of quote. As they have not confessed all that belong to the Logos, which is Christ, they have often uttered what is at variance with itself. Another quote. End of quote. Another quote. Through the Word Logos of God, Jesus Christ our Saviour became flesh. To these, end of quote, to these passages taken from the brief second apology, I had the following taken from the first, by the expression, the Holy Ghost at the Passover of God in Luke 1:35. So I think it's very, very clear from Justin Martyr that he quoted from the Gospels, and I think Tischendorf has made his point there. So I'm going to finish there. We're on page 74 there. So basically he's amassed a lot of evidence to show that the early church so we've finished now here. What we've had, basically, if an atheist or a skeptic comes up to you and says, how do we know that the Gospels were written by the Gospel writers? How do we know that these should be in the canon, and why were the others not in the canon, and all the rest of it? We can say, basically, from what Tischendorf is saying, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Tertullian, the early church fathers and the apostolic fathers were quoting these four Gospels as authoritative, and that proves that they are first century and that they come from these writers. That's the argument that he's making, and it's an unassailable argument, basically, absolutely unassailable. So there we are. That's basically what this hour has come to. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I absolutely love this kind of stuff. I really enjoy it, and enjoy reading this kind of material. And so I hope you found it a blessing. I make a cup of tea, have a rest for half an hour. I'm going to come back and I'm going to go on Christian Think Tank, pick an article there, and read it and just talk about it for an hour. So, hope you're okay, and God bless you all. Take care.